Hello and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 118, America versus China, the Napoleonic era returns. So what do I mean by that? So a lot of people look at the America-Chinese conflict that is currently kind of heating up and developing, and they look at it as, oh, well, this is the return of the Cold War. And I think it'll be different, and I think it's going to look a lot more like the Napoleonic era conflict between um, Britain and Russia, or Britain and France, than it will the Cold War. The Cold War was a lot of proxy wars where uh, sh- there was basically a battle of influence of like, okay, who gets to influence this and that, and there was no official declaration of war between the two countries, and I think that'll be different between America and China here, where there will be an official declaration of war and all that stuff will kick off, but they they won't really be able to do anything to each other, and that's I think one of the key things that differentiates this time around versus the Cold War is they they're basically going to declare war on each other and then they're going to stare at each other because neither can really project onto the other. The Americans don't have the troops to be able to really land troops in China, and China doesn't really have the navy to get their troops across the Pacific to America. They do have some. America does have some staging areas in like Japan and maybe India, but that's where I think it's got some similarities. Is um, America will be the rulers of the seas, and China will be the rulers of the land. Especially when you consider Russia, and they have an alliance there, and so they already control most of the Eurasian landmass. Um, one of the and so there's going to be like coalitions of groups that are fighting each other, like India and Japan and China might be going at each other. I know there's some changes there in terms of the relations, but they're China and India have kind of always been hot and cold in terms of that, where they kind of go back and forth as to whether or not they like each other at any given moment. And so I could see India ending up in America's sphere of influence, considering how things are going in Ukraine. Maybe, maybe not in terms of which side they end up falling on. It is a toss up at this moment, but we'll get into what I wrote here. The Sino-American War is going to look a lot like the Napoleonic Wars between France and Britain. Britain was the master of the waves, while France could not be matched on land. Likewise, I see America ruling the waves as they have been for the last century, while China is building out their navy. It is at the moment untested, and that's another key thing is uh, countries only go to war when the outcome is uncertain, which is kind of interesting. Because if you know you're going to lose, you don't declare war, and if you know you're going to win, you generally don't have to declare war because the person that is going to go against you won't do things to instigate you. It's only when power dynamics are close and it's kind of a question as to who's actually the top dog that conflict occurs, because it's the only way to sort out the pecking orders, as it were. A good example of this is like if you're gonna try to fight someone, like sometimes you run across somebody who's so much bigger. You're like, I'm just gonna. We already know the outcome of this. We don't have to fight, kind of things. And sometimes there's someone so much smaller that you're like, okay, I'm not gonna fight you, kind of thing. But like there's those times where you're pretty close to parity. It's not clear. Could I take this guy? Could I not take this guy? And those are the moments where uh, conflict arises, and nation states operate much the same way. So, um, to that point, while China is building out their navy, it is at the moment untested. France's main weakness during the Napoleonic era, when it came to its navy, was the admirals who were cowards and poor commanders. um, I just finished reading the Rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and one of the key aspects that kind of came up in regards to the Navy constantly is um, him wanting to get the Navy to get off their butt and do something, and they would never do it, and they just always sit in port, or they'd see a British naval vessel, and they would run for the hills and bounce back and just do anything to avoid a conflict at all costs, even though on paper their navy was superior. And so that's something to kind of consider. They had better ships, but their crews weren't as well trained, and things like that. And we've seen over history how that can make a huge difference. You can one of the reasons that Europe was able to conquer much of the known world during the 1800s. There was a technological differentiation between some of those places, but in some places the technology difference wasn't that great, but the organizational structure of the military and how to utilize the weaponry was much more sophisticated and advanced in Europe because of the uh, centuries of fighting that had occurred that refined those skill sets down into a very usable um, factor, where that didn't happen in a place like China, going back to like the Opium Wars and stuff like that. Because China should have been able to beat Britain when that kicked off. That might be another interesting place to compare the current thing is China versus Britain in terms of Opium Wars. But uh, from my limited knowledge of that situation, China was very weak and very corrupt at the time. And yes, China does have, every country has corruption issues. China's just more willing to acknowledge it than most countries, especially when it's really bad, which is kind of interesting. Um, and but Xi has been working on getting that fixed. How the the fixing that he has done hasn't, I don't think, been truly tested yet in terms of a conflict or something. But overall, it seems to be working from what I've seen. So, but that was at the very end of the Qin dynasty, Qin, and so they were. That was a dynasty that was kind of fading, and currently the current Chinese model, you could say, because they started the development of communism back in the 50s. It's been like 70 odd years. Maybe it's kind of on its waning aspect, but so far the dynamism of China at the current past 20 to 30 years, I think, has shown great strength. Yeah, they got some hurdles to overcome. Every country does. So we'll see what happens there. But like this current financial collapse that we're going to go through, people think they're going to wipe out China, but America went through the Great Depression and put it in its weak spot, and then it ended up taking over as the dominant uh, political force post World War II on the back of that financial collapse. So it's not necessarily. We'll see. We'll see what happens with China and stuff like that. And there's a lot of question marks there, but we're not going to get into that today. So it's interesting. So I have no idea how the Chinese admirals, going back to the France versus China example, I have no idea how the Chinese admirals act, or if they would act like France's. My gut feeling is that they wouldn't act like France's because one of the key tenets of Chinese culture is saving face, and it's a shame culture. And I don't think you could get away with the insubordination that the French generals got away with back in there, because culturally it just wouldn't work. There'd be too much shame, and they'd be forced to leave the position out of shame and not being able to hold the standard that is expected of them in with the Confucius way of thinking about things. Uh, so I don't see that. In fact, the most apt comparison would probably be the World War II Japanese Navy, but I don't know the inner workings politically. I know there's some political stuff, but I don't know kind of the mindset and mentality of the Japanese Navy. I have some understanding of stuff, but I'll just to let you guys know. The Japanese Navy was definitely competent, but it did create overly elaborate plans. One thing that I've seen out of China is that uh, I have not seen them. Okay, so far I have not seen anything to indicate that the Chinese are stuck on the Sun Tzu way of war that relies on deception almost to a fault, and that was one of the issues that Japan had during World War II. They wanted to use deception at all costs, and they fell into the trap of fancy fails. Basically, simple is always the best way to go. But China is also has a very strong history of large engineering projects, which we will get to. Uh, while they do, because obviously Sun Tzu is a great Chinese thinker, so while they do lean on this when you look at their political decisions, the decision around Taiwan is a good example of this, where they did a lot of the military actions but never actually invaded when Nancy Pelosi went over there. So that's a good example of kind of the Sun Tzu way of doing things. The Belt and Road Initiative, which we'll also get into a little bit later, is another Sun Tzu ism that you can kind of see in the Chinese political philosophy. But um, it it doesn't. When it comes to military force, they are much more willing to be. Well, maybe this is a bit of a claim, but um, they're not trying to be super underhanded and deceptive and trying to avoid conflict at all costs. I mean, they're still trying to prepare themselves as best they can, but um, it seems like they know when to be fancy and when to try to do all that elaborate planning stuff and when to keep it simple and just hammer forward and do the straightforward thing that you know what has to be done and what needs to be done, and you just need to put your nose to the grindstone kind of thing. And so I think China, better than Japan, has balanced out that, probably because a lot of that thinking and mentality came from China originally and then Japan. Usually when an idea gets exported, it always gets distorted by the people that are adopting it. And so it ended up a little bit different in how the Japanese interpreted those types of teachings versus how the Chinese interpreted it. uh, so while they do lean on Sun Tzu's way of war, they understand that fancy fails and they keep their plans realistic. This could trace back to their roots of large engineering feats like the Great Wall, as much as the Great Wall, which is about as close to modern military logistics, uh, which is very similar to how a modern military logistically works. And so if you compare that to how the classical Chinese engineered things, it was conducted. Uh, sorry, the way China used to build major engineering projects when it came to the Great Wall, and I think they changed the flow of the Yellow River and maybe the Yangtze. I don't know if that might be the same river. And so you had like these major engineering construction projects with millions of people all working and all of the logistical complications that went into that. That is something that culturally China is very good at doing and is still good at doing. You can kind of see that with a lot of the dams that they've set up. There was the Great Green something or other that they're going to build. They built a whole bunch of high-speed railway. They have their Belt and Road Initiative that they're working on. China is a master when it comes to infrastructure building, and it just so happens that skill set transfers incredibly well to modern military logistics, and is one of the core things that is whether you win or lose a modern military conflict, because a lot of it is just about mass of arms in a concentrated area over large supply chains. And if the Chinese are good at doing that, then they have the chance of really being successful in this upcoming conflict. Going back to the American side, a question mark is how competent is the U.S. Navy admirals? We have seen that the Army fall into a wokeism, but I can't recall any Navy officers or admirals that are falling for this level of convergence. Going back to the Napoleonic era, Britain's admirals during the Napoleonic era were extremely competent and daring. One could argue that Admiral Nelson, who was the Napoleon of the sea, and he was the one that basically destroyed. He ended up dying, I think, in this battle. If I'm thinking of the right admiral, there was a battle right off the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, basically where Spain is, Strait of Gibraltar, and he dies in this battle, but they win the battle and they basically wipe the French Navy, and the French Navy can no longer stand the British Navy, and now there's this clear divide of England rules the waves and France the land, because Napoleon is obviously still a brilliant general, but like the daring moves that Nelson pulled off was incredible. Things like flying in at this really risky direction and dodging all of these bays and coasts and stuff like that, and just so he could catch the French admirals off guard, because it was basically the illogical direction to come from because it was super high risk. But because it was super high risk, he knew, well, okay, they're probably not guarding it, and I can sneak in and I can surprise them and get really up close in their grill and unload all my cannons and blow up all their ships, which he did when Napoleon was down in Egypt, and he really messed up his plans down there because he couldn't get any ships to supply him while he was down there. So that was one of the interesting. The question remains: does America have admirals and other commanding officers that are their Napoleonic Britain's the equivalent of those in Britain during the Napoleonic era? It is hard to know from an outside perspective because I don't know any admirals or anything in the U.S. Navy. Ultimately, though, it's hard to see America losing control of the sea. Uh, we might lose some stuff here and there. We might not be able to force project our carrier groups with the anti-ship missiles and submarine force that China has, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we lose control. But that controls a, you know, maybe 200-mile radius off the coast of China, and the rest of the seas they don't have the navy, the blue water navy, to control and fight America for. And so I don't see. I see America still controlling basically all the sea shipping lanes. Uh, that leaves the land, and simply an alliance of Russia and China gives the majority control of the Eurasian landmass to the China and its allies. Then you also consider that places like Kazakhstan, Mongolia is going to be on their side because they're sandwiched between Russia and China. So a lot of the stands, Afghanistan, a lot of those are on their side. Turkey might end up on their side because that's a key Belt and Road thing that'll cut right through there, and they might become a cornerstone of trade again. That used to be back when it was Byzantium. That used to be a huge trade hub, but once some other sea routes were opened up, it dropped off in terms of its power and influence, and Byzantium also had issues with corruption and other things that led it to fall to the Turks, and who are now the ones that are in Turkey. Became the Ottoman Empire, now Turkey. Considering the sheer manpower difference and industrial material output difference as well, I don't see how China doesn't dominate Eurasia. One major X factor for China is the Belt and Road system. Back in the Napoleonic era, shipping was all but limited to sea travel. Napoleon tried to circumvent this with the continental system, but sea transport was so much more efficient that it was so much more efficient to trade by sea than it was over land. Because you had to use back then you were basically limited to transport wagons and canals. And canals, I mean, I get that like building a railroad and stuff like that is a construction project, but canals, I gotta imagine, are very, that's probably about the same in all honesty. The new Silk Road is still battling sea transport as the most efficient model, but it creates an infrastructure to circumnavigate or to circumvent the sea should that be needed. There is a major difference between the Napoleonic times, as the continental system lacked three major factors. One was the infrastructure to make land-based transportation worthwhile. So while Napoleon kind of demanded that everybody not trade with China, or that nobody should trade with Britain, there was no road system or canal system to support that. Second was that the infrastructure existed. Oh, I just got to my next point. Existed that even if the infrastructure existed, the means to transport across land was limited to wagons and canals. Comparing those to the highways and rail of today, and it really pales in comparison, even with the advent of the super cargo carriers and with the mass amount of cargo that can be transported with one ship. The last major point is that China is the manufacturing center of the world. This is probably the most important factor. While shipping overseas might be cheaper, if the only option is to buy the part you need comes from China over a land transport system, you will take it as there is no alternative. Compared this to the continental system, and France lacked a lot of leverage to enforce it because Britain was the world's manufacturing powerhouse back then. Well, free trade ultimately weakened their economic and political positions, which both Britain and France seem to understand on an intuitive level buying imports is always the cheaper option, or not cheaper, is always the easier option than spending decades building up your own industry. So places like Russia, who weren't industrialized at the time, Turkey, well, I don't think Turkey was part of the system, but a lot of the German states, especially since industrialization, one of the benefits of industrialization is concentration of manpower and stuff like that. And because of all the German states, there's a lot of tariffs running through. That was another factor, is you had all these German states, and basically there would be all these tariffs that ran through. And I actually, this, if I remember correctly, E. Michael Jones talked about how Napoleonic era is one of the things that spurred on German unification, because all the German states all of a sudden couldn't just tear all the princedoms. Is it princedom? Principality. All the principalities couldn't put up tariffs all over the place, and so trade was able to flow, and industry was allowed to build in Germany more, because you couldn't profitably make things in the center of Germany and ship them to the coast to then ship them across the seas because of the amount of tariffs it would hit. It would become way too expensive. And so German unification fixed this problem. It's kind of one of those balances that you got to figure out of how much free trade do you want, how much unification do you want, and you could keep it at the state level, but things are going to be a lot more expensive, and you're not going to be able to concentrate complex industrial level programs and in companies, I guess. Whereas you're going to have more sovereignty. You're going to have more community, national fervor, I guess. The other side is you get more economic power, more economic mass kind of going for you, but there's more homogenization. There's you lose some of your identity. It's like moving from identifying with the state you grew up in versus identifying with America. The same kind of idea. While free trade ultimately weakened their economic and political positions, which both France and Britain seem to understand on an intuitive level, buying imports is always easier than spending decades building up your industry. So maybe the Sino-American War will come to blows, and I see it more likely to come to blows than the Cold War, than the Cold War was. But I see it looking a lot like the Napoleonic Wars, where the two sides are basically staring at each other from across the sea, with both sides unable to directly affect the war. And so what will happen is America will get places like India and Japan and stuff like that to declare war. It'll look a lot like kind of how America is playing the Ukraine conflict right now. And interestingly, the amount of obtuseness that America has been showing recently is very similar to how Britain acted back during the Napoleonic era. So that's another factor to keep in mind with all of these different things that are going on. I think there will, if it does kick off, the conflict kicked off, that's why I think it'll be different than the Cold War, because the Cold War was a bunch of proxy wars, and yeah, like America and Russia were fighting, but it was like they were kind of going behind each other's back, and they never wanted to directly fight each other. I think the Chinese-American conflict, they will directly fight each other to a certain extent, but it will be through proxies. So it'll be like you'll have American troops on the ground, but it'll be like in India. It'll be in, I don't, maybe China will try to take Japan. We'll see. But it'll be like in those places, and I don't think either party is actually going to fight a conflict on their home soil. It'll be a conflict that they're fighting, but they're always fighting on the soil of other countries, which again is basically a lot of the Napoleonic Wars were fought all through the German states and on the German soil, and rarely, if ever, the major belligerents of Russia and Austria and Britain did they ever have conflicts happen on their soil. They basically happened in the German states, and they happened in Italy, where a lot of the conflict. And then obviously Napoleon didn't march into Russia at one point, and it ended in disaster. But that was that was the exception in the war, not the rule. in the conflicts. So that kind of summarizes that. Hopefully you guys found that interesting. If you are interested in listening to me on other platforms, I am on BitChute, I am on YouTube, I am if you prefer audio, I'm on Podbean and Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, basically where you can get all the podcasts. If you look me up under Up Chuck McDuck, it should come up, or you can look me up under According to Andrew. One of those two should get you what you need. Thank you guys for listening. Like and comment if you guys found it interesting, and share it with anybody that you think would enjoy it. Have yourselves a good day.